game that was played with paper currency, that had an online component where you might go and find matches. And then in many ways, what was the story that was being told? The story was the story of the community. Who do we want to be? What do we want to be? What is our future? So the storytelling in this sense was very much a transmedia story that went along with the community planning process. So I'm here, obviously, the outsider. This is like the weird mind-twisting example. Wait, the story is basically like theater that involves film and media, and a game kind of structures the participation. So this is the far example of some of what games are doing. Obviously, when I say games, a lot of you might think, oh, you can also build an online game and reach a lot of people. You can. Games are going through an interesting moment, though, because we realize that there's a whole language around them that is just starting to emerge. Most people can talk about plot and the 3-act structure. If I say 3-act structure, so many of you could identify with that. If I say game mechanic, how many of you would be able to tell me what is a game mechanic? What are the structural properties of how a game works? Despite the fact that all humans grow up playing games, it's something that all kids do. So we're having a really interesting moment. You know, documentary film 100 years ago isn't the same thing as it is now. I think the idea of documentary games are just starting to emerge. Some of them are going to look a lot more like they're games that structure participation in local communities. Some of them will be very much online. Wherever people are, they're playing, and those games are happening in both spaces, and they're happening across age groups. So that's a little bit of how games start to connect, and I think transmedia is a particularly relevant area for a lot of you as you're thinking about how to your work with films and storytelling connect with interactivity. So one word in terms of impact and designing impact, often when you watch a piece of media, at the end you make a choice. What am I going to do? What's the action? Games, in some ways, are all about choices. You can't get any further in the game unless you make a choice. What am I going to do in the game? So games, in some ways, the fundamental design choices are about what the kind of choices we give people. And I think that makes them an interesting media that thinks much earlier on about what are we giving people to do? What's the action? Games think a lot about action. And so I think that when we come back to questions of assessment and impact, you can often start asking people much earlier, what kinds of action are you interested in? Who are you? What's your identity? How does it relate to the stories, the people in the film or media product? How in some ways do you share a sense of responsibility for what happened to them by playing the game because you were partly responsible for the choices they took? How does that start blending the identity of the player with the identity of the person that you're representing in the form of media? So there are a lot of interesting questions with games, and games can have a number of different impacts, including like this game. I showed it because some of the impact is about social capital. So the outcome of the game is people build connections. In some ways, that's not a message. That's actual ties. They know new people. They can then mobilize together and say, here's what we want for Macon, here's what Macon should be, and I know more people that I can gather in because of that. So it's a very different kind of impact for a game that has this kind of goal, but there are, of course, also games that have message goals, and there have been a bunch of games made for a bunch of issues. It's a fun area to explore, and I think some of the impact assessment questions also can be fun to explore in that context. So.